On our next panel, we have Aaron Fry from Parsons School of Design Strategies. We have Jeffrey Mongrain visiting from Hunter College, and David Brody from the School of Art and Design, History and Theory. Briefly, Jeffrey, do you want to introduce your bio, or do you want me to give a little? Jeffrey creates gallery-based works and site-specific pieces. The site works are primarily located in spiritual spaces. His gallery-based sculptures are reductive and generally reference iconic forms. And I'll let him explain his rather extensive exhibition list once he gets to the mic. But we're going to start the afternoon with Aaron Fry.
I think the title of our panel is What is Evidence? How can you evidence the quality of your work? And what differentiates good or excellent RSCP from ordinary? So I just want to thank Thomas and Aaron for putting me on possibly the most difficult to answer kind of or address panel of the afternoon or the day even. But I just want to take you through what I would consider to be possibly a way of thinking about this, something of a conceptual model, I guess, in order to kind of perhaps, what would I say, disaggregate this large issue of how one represents one's RSCP into slightly more manageable components. So I felt that the essence of this was really evaluation in general. And the evaluatee and evaluator relationship. And, you know, I think if there's a common thread that probably connects us all in this room is that collectively we have thousands, probably tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of hours of classroom teaching experience. We're all educators. And I believe that this kind of understanding of the relationship of evaluation in the teaching context is something that we may be able to apply in a useful way to thinking about RSCP, or research, scholarship, and creative practice. Sorry, we're full of acronyms around here. And even sort of possibly create something that's comprehensible to us, and maybe possibly even I'm proposing as a platform for actually being able to frame and describe what we do. And I think this issue of framing came up this afternoon or late this morning in several different contexts and several other panels. Okay, so the first point I want to make is that teachers are a pretty tough crowd, I think. And I do think it comes back to this idea of criticality. Like we're in this position where we're critiquing, we're evaluating, we're assessing constantly. And this kind of almost curating of our students' work gives us this kind of, this ability to actually identify often quite acutely gaps or shortcomings in the work of others. So, this is probably based on experience in a directorial role here and answering very difficult faculty questions about what my intent was, et cetera, certain projects. I also want to talk about subjectivity. I think most of the people in this room are involved in the creative arts or in art and design, either theory or practice. And I would just like to kind of ground what I'm about to say in this idea that we really have to sort of embrace and own the fact that there's quite a degree of subjectivity in the kinds of evaluations that we bring to bear in the classroom. And so what is the basis of that subjectivity? How can we actually, if you like, validate that subjectivity? And, when I talk to colleagues, and I work closely with a colleague who's very sort of quantitative in the way that she thinks about evaluation, it's often very surprising to her that there is so much subjectivity at work in a kind of heuristic assessment, if you like, of what's going on with the student's work. So do we sort of, in a sense, ground this in an idea about experience? I know that when I introduce myself in the classroom, I guess this 20 years of full-time teaching experience thing comes out, right? So this is in a way of sort of, if you like, saying, trust me. I know what I'm doing. So is it about experience? Is it about the fact that you've kind of honed through experience your evaluation apparatus, even though you might not be disclosing every dimension of what it is and how it works to the students? These are questions that I'm going to leave hanging, like a number of other things. So I think this is more of a provocation than a sort of lecture. And then the all-important and really thorny question of the excellent versus good, or even the excellent versus good versus inadequate or insubstantial. And what that actually means, I think it needs to, in a sense, be acknowledged as a subjective evaluation, but a subjective evaluation that's born of experience and born of a certain kind of collective understanding. You know, I'm quite often surprised when I kind of put my own subjectivity against more quantitative measures, how much they actually kind of align with each other. So I suppose this comes back a little bit to the role of evaluation. When we are the evaluatees, when we're having our work evaluated by our peers, whether that's in a tenure committee context or some other committee of peers that's been convened. So yes, moving from the evaluator, which we're very accustomed to and in some ways very comfortable with, to the somewhat less comfortable kind of role of evaluatee, how do we handle this? I wanted to think about this in terms of metaphors. You know, I think that metaphors are very good ways of kind of bringing something that's comprehensible, something that we may feel a lot of confidence with and have experience with, to bear on something that there are a lot of question marks surrounding. So in this sense, I think the evaluation criteria that we might apply to a design project or to any other kinds of practical classroom instructions that we might give our students, generally we would talk about evaluation criteria, and we might even give weightings to those criteria, right? So for example, visual resolution being a certain percentage or weighting versus another weighting. And I wanted to propose this idea. This looks very corporate with these little jigsaw puzzle pieces that fit together. And I want to stress that the metaphor is not the jigsaw and the pieces coming together. The metaphor is really how we sort of understand this idea of self-evaluation, which I think really needs to precede the evaluation of a committee. In a way, I speak back to, I think, some of Timo's comments from the earlier panel about who is your reader, who are you writing to? And sorry, folks, I think that writing is really important here as well. And I don't think that I can avoid that and sort of say that it isn't, because I think if I were to put a little frame around all of these jigsaw puzzle pieces, I would say that writing is the connective thread here. So we can talk about intrinsic qualities of our work, what I would call the content of our work. And in some ways, this is a bit of a black box for a committee, because how are they going to look at somebody's work and say, well, you know, it's significant or it's interesting? Is it I find it interesting? Is it inherently interesting, inherently worthy? These are difficult questions to answer, and I think that they tend to be questions that a committee of peers would probably avoid trying to get into. You know, why is this, for example, in academic scholarship, why is this person focusing on, I don't know, Wordsworth rather than Coleridge or something like that? These become very moot kinds of questions that I think are not only unanswerable to some degree, but also a little unfair to the candidate. So how does one go about sort of arguing for the intrinsic qualities and the content aspects of the work? I think it is through writing. It's about reflection. You know, in some ways, again, Timo's issue about not so much peer validation, but am I asking kind of significant and interesting questions? And can this be proven in some way, or at least reflected on, in terms of perhaps peers, perhaps a kind of meta-reflection on motivation for why one would engage in such an activity? The second piece of the puzzle, would be about dissemination, and I think that's also been talked about today. And here I really think that dissemination to some degree is a numbers game. It's about how broadly am I broadcasting what I'm doing, and what kinds of audience quantitatively am I capturing this way? And then how can I evidence that reach and that breadth of what I'm putting out there? So we could talk about the media, multi-platform. We could talk about the potential audience and the actual audience, if you like. I do think the idea of kind of using numerical measures can be very useful for a committee to kind of understand at least how you see the impact through dissemination. The third one is impact and influence, and I think that's about the community or context that you're working within, right? You know, I think about an artist friend of mine who always used to talk about, I have a very small but important audience. Now, this sounds very elitist, right? But in his view, he was speaking to a small group of people who had, you know, quite a lot of kind of social currency, and perhaps also would help to kind of build the platform that he ultimately ended up achieving. So by having a very narrow focus, he was able to argue for a fairly narrow kind of dissemination of his work, but a very targeted one. So I think these are things that we need to kind of reflect on and think about. The fourth component, I would say, are synergies. And, you know, I think that an institution like Parsons, and probably most institutions, are self-interested enough to want you to not just be flying around doing your research, scholarship, and creative practice, but bringing those insights back, whether it's into the classroom or through your service. So how is this manifested in other areas of your practice or your career at the institution? How does this add value? I wanted to end with one final note, and that's something that I was told in my first job over 20 years ago. Be research active. And I was like, what on earth does that mean? You know, where are the numbers? Where are the quantities? Am I supposed to come up with 2 exhibitions a year? Is that acceptable? How many publications? And I think these are questions that I've often had to field from colleagues. And the answer always is that it sort of depends. And I think it really depends on how these things are coming together, how these components are coming together, and whether you're doing it regularly as well. So I'm not going to kind of stand here today and talk about you having to cross a certain kind of threshold or bar, but more to reflect on these components in relation to your RSCP. So it was all I had to say today.
So I wanted to talk about some of the things that I have thought about over the course of my academic career in terms of this idea of evidence and what evidencing is about. And so a lot of this will refer back to what Aaron was describing, but I unfortunately do not have a jigsaw puzzle. Although that was very effective, and I like that. Some of the key things that I have thought about, I finished my PhD in 1997, and one of the things that I thought about from the moment that, actually before, as I was writing my dissertation, I think goes back to what Aaron described, which was this idea of being research active. Right, so how is it that you can be research active, and how is it that you can be research active in a way that is reasonable to yourself, but also in a way where others outside of yourself are looking at you as someone who is doing excellent work in terms of being research active. And so I'll give you some of the things that I thought about. One of the things that I definitely thought about was that at some point, and again, I started thinking about this, in 95, 96, a long, long time ago. I had this idea that someone somewhere was going to be reviewing me for promotion or tenure or something along those lines at some point. That was definitely something that I always had in the back of my mind. And what I always kept, initially it was a piece of paper, and then it moved on to devices like this, was a list of potential readers of my dossier. So I always had a running list, and by the time I came up for tenure, there probably were 30 or 40 names that were there. Some of these were people that had no idea who I was. Some of these were people who I had met at conferences or met at other venues, and we were reading each other's work. Some of these people were so far in the stratosphere above where I will ever be in academia as well. And it was helpful, I think, to have those people in that reach category, right? Because in terms of thinking about an audience, I think that's always an important group to think about. So I always kept this list. I don't keep the list anymore, but I still keep the list in the back of my mind. And one of the other things that I always did and continue to try to do, to use a word that my mother uses a lot, is schmooze, right? So that if I go to academic conferences, or if I'm sharing work, the idea of trying to make different connections amongst people who may actually end up being peer evaluators at some point, right? Sometimes there's a lovely coincidence where you find out that your work is being read for a journal or for a press or for some other venue by someone who actually knows you quite well, but that makes sense, right? Because again, the audience sometimes that we write for, I'll speak for myself, is sometimes very, very small. So in this, I'm working on finishing this book about hotels. There's not a lot of people who write about hotels. So just by the nature of sharing work, reaching out to people, asking people to read things, some of those people actually ended up being evaluators of this manuscript that I just finished. And this also relates to, I think, the idea of putting yourself out there and constantly thinking about disseminating and dissemination in terms of different venues. And one thing that I have been very delighted by with what goes on the promotion and tenure committee at Parsons is the committee's willingness to look at a variety of venues, right? I come from a somewhat unorthodox background in that I have a multidisciplinary degree in American Studies, but at the same time, I come from a very orthodox and conservative background in terms of the decisions that I've made with publishing, and I will admit that. And for better or worse, it's the path that I have gone down. But a lot of our colleagues want to disseminate to audiences that are much wider. Some of our colleagues who do presentations at places like museums and museums to large lectures at museums or to other types of venues in terms of large arts organizations. The committee is very open to multiple different ways of thinking about dissemination, as well I think we should be, because certainly there are many people and many people who are in those audiences who are listening to what people have to say, and that's another form of dissemination, right? Sometimes it becomes tricky in terms of how it is that you evidence those different types of dissemination, but I think it's important to be aware that there's lots of different ways of doing it, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it needs the imprint of a university press to be doing something in one way or another. And then finally, I also want to say that it's really important to think about, to go back to this idea of being research active, to have multiple projects. The best piece of advice I ever received while thinking about how to prepare my dossier was this art historian named David Josselet, who now teaches at CUNY, said to me, you can't look at it like a race with a finish line. Right? In other words, just because you have finished projects X, Y, and Z and you're going to submit that in terms of your dossier, you should think about what's next. Because if you think of that's the end of it, I've done this, I'm now, I'm finished, give me tenure and I can relax and have a great time. Or be like the student yesterday who sent me an email that she didn't turn in her first paper because she got a surprise trip to the Bahamas. Swear to you. Right, you can't quite go to the Bahamas yet. I mean, I think that's part of the lesson, and actually it's part of what I think also makes life after promotion so delightful, is this idea that it's a continuing exchange, and it's a continuing exchange of being research active where that evaluation absolutely continues. Where that one still gets very nervous about getting the letters from peer evaluators about what the peer evaluators have to say about one's work. And I think the other thing that I'll say about the peer evaluators is that often it makes the work much better. So the idea of not stopping, even though my kind of obsessive compulsive list I no longer am keeping. So that's it.
Hello, and thank you for the invitation. I appreciate being here. I The idea of research is something, I've recently become part of the committee at Hunter College, where we advise the faculty who are coming up for tenure and promotion. I've actually been tenured 3 times, and it seems like every time I got tenure, I would leave the positions that I was at. Not because I got tenured, but I simply got a better job. And excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. I've also just recently, I've been a full professor at Hunter for about 7 or 8 years, and I've recently gone through another research promotion to become a distinguished professor. This was grueling. This is nothing like I experienced before going through tenure or promotion. This was a very large international thing, and I'm very glad that's over with. As far as research, I'm a visual artist. I'm head of MFA sculpture, and I teach mostly at the graduate level. At Hunter College, we have about 130 MFA students, and that's where I do all of my teaching. So it's very different. When I taught at undergraduate, the idea of evaluation for me was much more democratic. It was much more accessible and kind of open. I'm in a nice position now where evaluation and critique of students can be a little bit more pointed. Most of the graduate students already have a kind of a visual language. And also, they research us, the faculty. They know what our work is, and they select us depending on what they think our sensibility is. So in part, I get to teach a little bit from a point of prejudice, because I am talking a little bit about my own aesthetic, my own sort of conceptual interest. I just want to quickly take you through some of my own pieces as the students look at them. And also, I've selected specific pieces that have kind of a research orientation. Is there a way just to get the image up?
Yeah, if you press the slideshow button.
Yeah, or this one, right?
No, on the other
Oh, yeah, that
side,
one.
the little, yeah.
There we go. Thank you. As you can see, as being a sculptor, I'm relatively low tech. This is a piece entitled Evening's Breath. And what you see here is the 2 aspects, very broadly speaking, that I bring into my own work as research, I show in spiritual spaces, cathedrals and synagogues. I've now shown in about 24 of them around the world. And I also do work that I work with scientists as often as possible. And I'll get to that. And it's really fascinating having those 2 camps to sort of draw from. In many ways, I personally think they both deal with absolutes, and they both deal with abstractions in really kind of fascinating ways. So this piece is entitled The Evening's Breath. What you see here is a small pool of water in the middle of this floating pillow form, and it has 9.5 ounces of water. So every day the museum has to fill. That's the amount of moisture that a woman breathes during 8 hours of sleep. You know how you blow against a piece of glass and you see that moisture? So this is your breath during your sleeping period. This piece is entitled The Iris of John Dagman. John Dagman, he's recently been knighted in Britain. He is the guy who invented the iris scanning technology. Remember that Tom Cruise movie where they were scanning the eye? This guy invented it. So I called him up. I was dealing with these kind of circular windows. You know, you see on cathedrals these sort of beautiful round windows at the entrance, and it has this very it's sort of the eye of God kind of thing. Well, I called up John, and he was coming to New York, and he was nice enough to let me photograph his eye. Brilliant man. I didn't understand the titles of his books, let alone anything else. And I decided this iris scanning technology, I think it's somewhat ominous as a social entity. So I only photographed his left eye, which is the evil eye. He doesn't really look evil, does he? He's just the sweetest guy. Excuse me. And then one of the cathedrals that I showed in was in Cologne, Germany. This is a very different kind of research. And previous to my being at Hunter College, I was a professor at the Glasgow School of Art in Scotland. The area that I taught in was called environmental art, which really is just a fancy way to say site-specific work. So all the students had to do site work, but that meant a great deal of research, understanding the site, getting permission to show, dealing with the public, the safety, all of these sort of things. So the creative art part of it was only really a small portion of it. So this is in Cologne, Germany. And when I saw the site, and one of the things about researching when you do site work is I try my very best to not have any idea what I'm doing when I enter the space. I try to research, understand the visual, understand the history, and then let that influence what sort of visual decisions that I make. This was a space where I was told they used to, during World War II, hold classes for children to join the Hitler Youth Party. Very sort of dire. And one of the things that they did when these children passed this course and became part of the Hitler Youth was they had to leap over a small fire. It's a very pagan ritual to demonstrate allegiance. So I went back to my hometown and I found these branches and I cast them in resin and I created this kind of typical American Boy Scout kind of form of kind of a campfire, and also brought artificial snow, and that's what you see sprinkled on the bottom there. By the way, carrying large bags of artificial snow through airports can be a little difficult. I should say the first piece I showed you, the pillow, it was purchased in a biennial that I was in the United Arab Emirates, and it was purchased probably about a year after September 11th, and they wired the money into my bank account, and I actually got a call from the FBI. Agent Hansen, why is this money? Anyway, that's another story. This is it. This is an example of these German youths leaping over the small fire. Some new pieces that I'm doing in this sort of Catholic sense that my work has is I've been collecting paintings of Last Supper throughout history, and I found about 65 of them now. If you see on the table, you see this very beautiful kind of light drawing of the chalice, the Holy Grail. So I'm in a process now of recreating 65 Holy Grails from historic paintings. Excuse me, in this beautiful blood red glass. One of my first students was my brother, James Mongrain. He now makes all of Dale Chihuly's work out in Seattle. Isn't that a beautiful drawing? Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. So my idea is that I'm going to create this sort of large pool of these 65 finding these Holy Grail pieces. I also, might be a little disturbing, but you see how in the very bottom there you have the dog and the cat? In a lot of these historic paintings, they have the iconography of the dog being the loyal, and you always have the cat sitting by Judas. And I have this really beautiful stuffed dog and cat. I know, it's a little disturbing. This was another site piece. This is the Glasgow Cathedral in Scotland. And when I started researching, I found a space in the crypt of this cathedral. And I'm walking around and I'm asking what the air vent is down on the floor. And they said, well, they just put in a new air vent. And when they lifted the stone, they found 10 skeletons buried from the era of the Black Plague. There were so many people dying that they just buried them underneath the stone. So I created this kind of figurative plumb bob as kind of a memorial piece to hang directly above it. Am I going too fast? Am I talking too fast? Sorry. One of the other pieces that I do, depending on where I go, I try to research different places and sites. And in different countries and museum shows, I do what I call sound translations. So this is really like a sound wave. You know how you drop a pebble into the water and you get this ripple of sound. I had a show here in New York, and I was trying to think, and I try to find sound fragments that to me feel iconic. This was my New York sound piece. This is that famous speech of Lou Gehrig at Yankee Stadium, where he's saying his farewell, and that he says, I consider myself the luckiest man. So you've got the luckiest man. It's just that kind of ripple. My favorite part of this piece is the very center. It took me about a month to get into the old Yankee Stadium and collect sand from where Lou Gehrig stood, where he gave his speech. I have a big pile of sand that I really like. I'm not sure how much time I'm taking up. I'll go through a few other pieces. This is another pillow form, and that glass globe that you see in the center is a very thin piece of glass. I decided to, and underneath it is a negative impression of an ear. I found out that people who smoke, you know when you smoke, you know how when you're on an airplane and you plug your nose and you can pop your ears? Well, when you smoke, a little bit of smoke goes through your ears. So smokers lose their hearing more quickly than people who don't smoke. So what you see there is a little glass globe, and I very slowly blew the smoke of a single cigar into this very thin piece of glass. That beautiful, gorgeous gold color is just nicotine. That's what's happened. All you smokers, that's what's happening to your ears. This is another cathedral that I showed in. This was the easiest installation that I did. I had this beautiful altarpiece with the Last Supper, and I decided to just sculpt a pool of blood that is the amount of blood in a human male body. That's about 1.3 gallons. And I just set it down in front of the altar, and you've got that reflection of kind of the Last Supper. You never know when you go into these places how your work is going to be responded to, because these are obviously spiritual spaces. I once had a group tell the bishop that she was insulted by my work because there should be no art in cathedrals. And we said, well, it's all art. You know. But what was nice about this was people were coming up and they were kneeling down and they were reaching out and they were touching the piece. It became a sort of an important piece for me. I think I should probably finish up there. Thank you.
So Jeffrey, you said you've received tenure 3 times. Can you talk a little bit about how you write about your work as a visual artist and how you anticipate it's going to be received by your readers?
I mean, we've been going through that at Hunter too. I was the chair for about 1.5 years, 2 years, and that evaluation process, particularly with visual arts people. Most of the writing is done. The visual artists bring writing from other people. They, of course, have to write the content, but we primarily look at the venues, and this is the hard part, deciding what venues and giving them some level of credence depending on solo museum show or commercial galleries and all of that, and setting up an evaluation process. So mostly the studio people do very little writing about their own work other than being descriptive and having a very clear resume. I don't know if that answers your question.
Part of it.
Okay, I'm sorry, what was the other part?
How do you make it sound equal to the contributions from faculty who are doing the publishing?
Again, I think that is what we research the venues of where people are showing. And obviously a museum show or a retrospective show. And we also look at what people write. Almost everybody that I work with will have a history of reviews and critics who write about them. And that becomes an important part. And we're all reasonably knowledgeable about what venues they show in and how we subjectively decide the quality of those venues.
To the last speaker again, do you write about your thinking process in constructing a piece? For example, the last image that you showed us of the pool of blood in front of the altar, do you explain what your rationale is for doing that?
I do, and this is a conversation I have with my grad students sometimes, because some of my colleagues believe that if you have to explain the work, if you have to discuss the content, that, well, some believe you shouldn't have to, that it's a visual language. I almost always have 2 or 3 sentences related to the content, especially if it's place or science. So I tend to write about my work. I've just opened a show in the Dominican Republic at the Museum of Modern Art, and every piece has a paragraph that talks about the content. Personally, I like that, but that's just me.
Is it the quality of the exhibition space and what's written about the exhibition, or do you evaluate those separately? Like if somebody hasn't been critically reviewed, but is exhibiting in strong locations, how do you balance that?
It's very much both, but I think when we do our evaluations at Hunter, it is first the quality of the venue, and then what is written. But frankly, most of the colleagues that I work with, we seldom hire people under the age of 40, it seems, because we hire people who have a fair amount of experience. They're already somewhat established in their careers. And we almost always hire known quantities, if you will. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have another question. It seems as though in your department, it's pretty clear who your faculty are. But in our case, particularly in my division, we have such a range of faculty doing a range of work, so that we have people doing this kind of work as well as people doing very traditional academic publishing. And one of the difficulties in the review process is how do you evaluate somebody who's doing this kind of work when the reviewer on the committee is outside of this domain and from a very traditional academic domain. And so committees always come up with questions of how do you evaluate this kind of work. And so
Yes.
I wonder if you could give some pointers to that.
Well, selecting reviewers, we get a list, and we have about, I think, 40 full-time faculty, including art history, and about 85 adjuncts. And we request from them a list of people that they recommend that we reach out to for evaluations, and then we select another group. And so we find people who are in the field, who know that kind of work, to write evaluations, who we deem as being professionals in the field. And so we get a lot of outside. And the committee is fairly large and diverse. We make sure we have art historians, painters, sculptors, and so on. So it's a diverse group. My last promotion was very different because I was evaluated by about 35 people, and there was not an artist or art historian in the group. They were all science, English professors. They were from around the school. And so that's why the review process for me was much more expansive. And then there were certain things that they understood and other things that they don't. I will say too, we are now putting together a list of blogs that we deem credible, that my colleagues who know these things know that they publish or put positive things out there in a quality fashion. So that is becoming part of our evaluation process now.
Do you share the comments on the evaluations once
sorry?
you evaluate someone? Do you share the comments of the evaluation with the person that's being evaluated?
When I was chairing the art department, I would do it individually. Yes. Frankly, I can only really speak about Hunter, but we've given tenure to everybody that I've worked with in the last 20 years, and our promotion among our adjuncts and the evaluation of the adjuncts is that becomes a little different, but to answer your question, I did it as the chair. I don't know if my current chair does.
What I was trying to do with the jigsaw puzzle pieces was to give a sort of framework. So instead of actually trying to describe what you do in your research, scholarship, and creative practice in this very holistic way that can often, I think get buried. I feel that as a teacher there's more precision in the evaluation process if there are criteria that I then weight. And so I brought up the example of my friend, the artist, years ago, having relatively small dissemination, which he might put a smaller weighting on, and then putting a larger weighting on the impactful, but yet small audience that he had for his work, right? So what I was saying is that I think that this is a framework that you can weight differently, but if you understand the kind of the territory, if you like, and these different kinds of domains in which you can sort of conceptual envelopes into which you can sort of you can cross-reference what you're actually doing against some of these criteria, then that can be a useful way of framing and thinking about your RSCP. I think I talked about the importance of numbers too, and validating some of your impact numerically if that's possible. Yeah, I mean, it can be simply in terms of kind of the circulation of some of the journals or blogs that you have. If you can get hold of numbers in which to kind of anchor your impact. There's usually impact factors, right? Like a lot of journals have impact factors associated with them. How that math works, I don't know. Probably Aaron knows more about that than me. But all of these things sort of help us to crosswalk what can appear at first glance to be a very kind of qualitative and subjective, sort of narratively oriented way of describing what we do with something that's a little bit more grounded. So use numbers where relevant. So for example, if numbers are relevant in terms of dissemination, great. They're probably not necessarily relevant in terms of kind of trying to elevate the intrinsic value of what you do. That's probably more a narrative technique. Does that?
And in terms of numbers, you're talking within a more academic area than a commercial area?
But either or, because as we know, there are people who do patents, who kind of work in the commercial sphere, and clearly quantitative information is also important, I think, to integrate into how you're describing what you do. Again, when and if it's relevant.
And there are panels that are going to be discussing this coming up with commercial, non-traditional forms, interdisciplinary practice,
Yes.
et cetera. But I think one example to Aaron's point about metrics is, for example, in the United States, those in architecture would have Journal of Architectural Education or Society of Architectural Historians. Those are major publications nationally, but may be entirely unaware that those publications have a ranking internationally too. And we're familiar with them within the context of the United States, but they're not necessarily viewed in a certain level internationally, and you may be involved in a publication that's a much higher ranking in terms of the number of citations of the research, but many people on a reviewing committee in an American university may not be familiar with that publication. So you have to, in your narrative, provide the evidence of where this fits in terms of the broader field and discipline, which is it's not even just traditional scholarship, it's just how do you provide a context so people understand the reach and impact of the work and the vehicles you're working through?
Mm-hmm. And this final phrase about being research active, I can remember my dean or chair at the time, the first institution I worked at, basically that was the directive to all faculty. It was very sort of flaky, if you like, just get out there and do some stuff. Since then, that institution's now moved to a quantitative measures for figuring out, research points. How many points has each faculty member accumulated, and what do those points equal relative, it's actually tied to funding. So the UK, I know, does this, New Zealand, Australia. Not saying it's a great model, but there's certainly been a sort of a move towards some of these ways of accounting.
I just wanted to respond to what David said earlier about accumulating this list of names when you were doing your PhD, that you had this sort of, I guess you had the inner circle of people who would respond to you and be very candid with their feedback.
Right.
And then you have perhaps the next tier of people who may not know you but may be sympathetic to your interests. And then you have the upper firmament, so to speak.
Yep.
And this would be people who are the gods.
No.
Upper firmament, I call it.
Absolutely.
Okay, just like responding to Jeffrey's religious analogy. So my question was, I guess I was looking at I was paralleling my own trajectory. Because I'm a graphic designer, I was thinking when I was younger, the peer, it was the reverse for me. the tier, the upper tier was the inspiration, but then I wasn't looking for inspiration for people of my level or my age. But as I evolved and got more mature and was really interested in experimental thinking and practices, I was being inspired by those who were younger than me. So it was the reverse. So for me,
Yeah, that has definitively, absolutely 100% happened. Yes. So now when I go, yes, no, I don't. Again, I don't keep this list anymore. No, when I go, so I go to the art history meetings usually every other year, but the meetings that I go to every year are the American Studies Association, and the panels that I go to now, the people that I'm following, the books that I'm buying are all, what the Academy would describe as junior scholars. Are what the Academy would describe as junior scholars. And I have this kind of junior senior thing. It gets me crazy because it makes me feel even older and grayer. But absolutely, Lucille, it's such a great point. Because that's, to me, who's doing the really exciting work. And sometimes when I go to this meeting, and I go to the session of this caucus that I'm part of, the Material Culture Caucus session, which I'm scratching my head thinking, we are like the oldest farts in the world. We're still doing the same thing we were doing in the 1980s. And then I go to these other sessions with these younger scholars, and to me, they're the exciting, that's who I want to be following. And it is, that flip has definitely happened.
well, it's
see
just
it
that my mentors, so to speak, 30 years ago, have in their work not moved, and
Right.
they have been calcified. And I keep thinking, they're stuck, and so where do I get inspiration, or who are these people who
Right.
I respect and who would actually give me honest feedback, and some of them are my ex-students.
Absolutely. Yeah.
No, I think it's great. It keeps me young.
I absolutely feel the same exact way. Yeah, and I mean, the other thing about looking at work of people who are just finishing their PhD, or people who are, working on their first book project, again, I'm relating this to my field, is that I feel like they're also taking the risks with their work that I was always too terrified to take before tenure, but God bless them, they're doing it, and it's really inspiring. Because it's very thought-provoking and generating of new ideas, at least I feel like it is within my work, that isn't necessarily happening in terms of some of the people who were originally in that pantheon at the beginning when I was keeping the list. Yeah, no, it's a great point.
And I think a parallel to that in studio too is we're seeing all these new venues, these new ways that the younger faculty are finding places to get their work out there, where I'm becoming one of the older faculty and I'm showing in the more conservative places now. And so we have to be aware of where these places are, and even these kind of community centers that are showing amazing work, and all these performance venues and so on. Because there's just a whole new range of different types of venues that I'm not so much a part of any longer, but my younger colleagues are.
Yes, you could.
I absolutely support that point, and so we say that's also where our graduate students are so valuable to us. I would also make a plug, because I've feel as though it's sort of flogging a dead horse, but that's where we absolutely need PhD students in Parsons too, to give us that. But I think the flip side of that, going back to something that Erin said, and particularly in academic fields, the flip side is that, unfortunately, as academic conferences nowadays, not necessarily in the United States, but certainly one sees it with scholars in Europe or from Australia, presenting papers at conferences which are as boring can be and have absolutely no value to anyone because of not because of the United States tenure system, but because of the institutional funding model, which I think for many fields has been a complete disaster and has completely quashed everything you were just saying in the last 10 minutes, which is extremely unfortunate.
Here at Parsons, we have a variety of kinds of contracts, and there are slightly varying procedures in terms of how the individual gets reviewed, but for the most part, it goes directly to a division-wide group. Whereas what you're describing is something with the review happens very much at a local level, at the department level,
Yes.
where, as you described it, the people who were doing the reviewing
That's
were
the first
already
stage.
very familiar with the individual and the nature of the work and the nature of the practice.
For the most part, yes.
practicing in. And so you have a familiarity that other people here might not have to the field that they're reviewing, and thus all this discussion about how to contextualize one's work to place it. And so you said that or I'm concluding that therefore that is a reason that there's less of a need for extensive writing on the part of the individual outside of making sure that the resume is complete.
Well,
But my question is that where does it go from there, from the department level? And when it goes beyond the department, is it a qualitative review or is it strictly a procedural review?
Well, the review changes rather dramatically after it leaves the department. So when I was the chair, I probably took about 5 people through promotion and tenure. Internally, we have a small group, including people from all the areas, and we evaluate their work and if they're historian, what their writing is, if they're studio people, their venues, and so that's an internal evaluation, and generally considered the most important. If we pass somebody by a vote of 5, our executive committee, then we take it to what we call our division, our entire school. So I would represent that person in front of the dance, music, also the English, and the other professors. And the professor would have to come and meet with what we call our divisional committee, which would be 10 other departments outside of art.
So that's just arts and humanities, it's not all of Hunter.
Yes, that's the second stage.
Right.
Then it goes to the school-wide, where there were 45 chairs at Hunter throughout the entire school. I would then present that person to all 45 chairs. The president and the lawyer would be there, making sure I wasn't saying anything inappropriate. And then there would be a vote of those 45 chairs. Then it would go to the board of directors of CUNY for their final vote. But generally, when it gets past the first 2 stages, unless new evidence comes up, usually legal related, it usually passes. So those are the 5 stages.
And do you let candidates know as it's going? Would you let the candidate know that you passed the department?
I'm not sure I was supposed to, but I did.
Okay.
Yes.
No,
Yeah.
That's a model I think we should embrace.
Indeed.
I will be very upfront and say that, although I know that there's a lot of tension at the university about it, and we have different divisions that practice that in different ways.
It's I think I was fortunate that it was always a unanimous positive vote.
Right.
If I would have had to speak to somebody about a split vote.
No, that's a complicated conversation, right?
Yeah.
No, fair enough.
Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly pick up on a point that Hazel made before we move on. And this was about this kind of system that's very quantitative about totaling up what people's research value or output is, actually. And then this is tied to funding. I have had the same experience meeting people at conferences who are basically there to accumulate points, it seems. And, this is, I think, one of the issues when we start to also rank journals, when we start to rank exhibition venues and things like that. I'm not saying that these measures are not valid, but the alternative to that appears to me that it's rather incumbent on the candidate for promotion to provide the narrative kind of web that allows us to understand the practice more holistically. Clearly that becomes an issue at a school like Parsons, where we have very widely varying abilities to be able to do that using the English language. So it was interesting hearing your point, because I think we have these different kinds of paradigms that we're sort of not quite in any one of them.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay, I think we have to move on. Thank you very much, David, Aaron, and Jeffrey, for sharing your information and also tips about, how to address, critical issues, which is, how to differentiate excellence from from good work. By the way, Aaron is the former chair of Parsons APT, and David is the current chair of Parsons APT. And I could not think of a better set of people who could, open the conversation for the second session block. So these two people can be a great resource to you, particularly if you have any procedural questions related to tenure review or the review for academic advancement. And thank you also, Jeffrey. What you said is really credible, particularly knowing that it's coming from someone who went through the tenure process 3 times over. Okay, so we are going to continue on this conversation, and the conversation is going to be a bit more contextualized in the sense that we will situate this in terms of the different nature of disciplinary work that you work with. So the session that follows is about validating your work and creative practice, particularly for faculty working in a highly interdisciplinary field. So for this session, we have 3 panelists.
A little background on MT while the panels come together. I think it's important. He's currently a principal at Hypnos Design, the president of E-Learning Consultants, and the chief operating manager of International Architects Group.
I think I'm going to focus on the topic, in this case, the tenure at my college, Spitzer School of Architectures. And I want to show you a little about my work because it's highly interdisciplinary and it really has a variety of integration with technology, computers, photography, renderings, and architectures. So it's always very, when you have a mix of all these combination of ingredients, sometimes it's very often very difficult to go through it and publish your work. And because, it's so much stuff, so much energy. So somehow, I think a reviewer look at it, they have a hard time to somehow prove it. So, so I want to, tell you what I do, most important thing. I want to walk you through a few of the slides, images that I created. So you know a little bit about what I'm currently doing. All these images are done by computers, but in the past, many years ago, that before the computers is taking place, we usually use hand to draw these wonderful drawings using our imaginations and use the medium of our tools to create it. So, but this is a little before the computer times, and as we slowly step into 21st centuries, we found ourselves that we have a tool called computer that can help us to generate image. The image is such a case that not only for representation, but for a real images, as real as it can get, because computer can generate images that up to a point that you compare them, you can't tell the difference. And I use this, very often. I always talk to my daughters, I talk to my relatives, talk to my friend, I talk to my student. I said, you look at these images, can you tell me that it's a real photograph or it is a computer rendering? So very often they say, well, I can tell. I have a student say, listen, nothing can fool me. I can actually see a computer rendering from 100 miles away. So I say, well, listen, I'm going to show you 2 images. We'll go through several images. I'm going to show you, and you're going to tell me which one is rendering, which one is generated by a photography. At the end, of course, everybody's confused. It's very hard to tell which is real and which is generated by computer. So I'm into this fascination because my background in architectures, I was trained very early on. When I went to school, we have no computers. Wow, I tell you my age. So we basically learned T-square. We learned about parallel ruler, about valence. We use pencils. We use all kind of mediums to draw airbrushes. And I was always fascinated about creating images, renderings, drawings, create perspective. Now, how I hook up with the computers really is because I use my hand very much, and I like to use my hand. Like to use my imagination. I like to draw. When everybody else is writing, I always draw. So, and this really gave me one time, you know, before the computer eras, that when you draw renderings, you spend a lot of effort overnight, maybe a week or two, you create this beautiful, realistic. They believe it's realistic, but it's beautiful renderings, and you show that to your classmates, and everybody get very excited. But then the things that your design professor come over and say, listen, well, you know, you can change this, you can change that. So I changed this, I changed that, and what happened? Took another 2 weeks to finish another renderings. So, but here I see the opportunity. One time, a friend of mine showed me that you can use a computer to generate perspective, because you're talking about 1 point, 2 point perspectives. You're talking about you need to have creating a vantage point. So I remember that when I try to do a big, large drawings with 2 point perspectives, I end up to have my drafting table is just too small. So when I went on to lumberyard, I purchased a door for my drafting table, so I can do 2 point perspectives. So this somehow, so my table get bigger and bigger, and of course, that led me to the next level, which is the computer. And I saw the computer has the ability, even that very early on, it can create perspectives so easy and without a big table. And my workspace all of a sudden changed. It changed from a huge giant drafting table to little tiny desktop computers. So I see this opportunity to use a computer to create images that can use our creativity. Now, the question, how do you explain this to panels of reviewers that are not really trained in this computer age? And because they believe that in order to draw, in order to see, you have to understand the training, the original foundation of architecture drawings. They believe that you have to know this, you have to know that in order to create this and that. Now, but seriously, when I'm facing this question, I mean, even today, I'm going through the same process, which, your generations, matter of fact, they don't have that education, they don't have that training, because today, architecture students go through a totally different training than we used to. Their primary medium is computer. They use computer a lot. And as a matter of fact, our curriculum has been moving, from introducing computers from the 4th years to 2nd years. From 2nd years, now we're talking about moving to the 1st year. So, computer has the greatest impact. But one of the things you talk about computer is you can't treat computer no different than a pencil, because, my years of through trainings and producing and drawings, design, and I always find out that the fascination that there is no difference. To me, a computer is a tool. A computer is a pencil for me. And I very often run into questions that my student raise is like, well, I like to use my hand, and computer somehow take that opportunity away from me. I have a very hard time to understand. I said, well, don't you use your fingers? Do you use a hand when you move your mouse? I mean, the motion of a mouse, is that the same as the motion of a pencil? And what's the difference? But however, this medium somehow is kind of different. Is perhaps you use a commands, you use the certain things, you use Photoshops in the REST image manipulation programs, versus you using a V-Rays to generate computer images. But the principle and fundamentally are the same. Okay, so this is a tough time, especially going through, our for tenure process and then get your documentation, your dossier together when you're looking for tenure. And especially something very interdisciplinary, especially something that's kind of new. It's always hard to explain. It's always very difficult, especially, when you talk about renderings. How are you going to communicate this with your peers? How are you going to somehow tell your peers that what you did is correct, is the futures? And there's a lot of debates. But what happened is, I'm going to just, quickly, because I'm actually, preparing this for the tenure process, so I'm going to just quickly going over the three things. This is my, I wish I want to focus. Certainly, I think this, maybe the topic, the flavor of today's discussion is a little more than the last one about the publications, but I just want to talk a little bit in my school, what we value about teaching, we value about services, we also talk about merits, in this case, scholarship, and also publication. Now, in terms of teaching, you're good teachers. That's what I heard. They're never a problem. Services, well, they were pouring all kind of community works, all kind of jobs on you, your first whatever years that you have. Now, to me, when I first came up, 10 years is 5 years. Now they stretch up to 7 years. Let me tell you something. 5 years too short. 7 years. Now, to many, 7 years is very short period of time. To me, 7 years is too short. So, you talk about times. There's never enough time because, in order for a real publication to be published, it normally takes about 3 years. Your first year, the proposal, and then you sign contracts. 1 year to work on your publication, and the last year, of course, they published. It takes about 3 years, 3 and 4 years to really actually see your proposal, your book, really in the shop, on your hand. And of course, take another year for everybody to have it. So it's a lengthy process. So you're talking about, the times that you need to do. So I in the terms of services, I don't know where the topic today is services. And I said enough is enough, and don't take on too much. And my recommendation is that can ruin you. So I say that in this regard is that the service is enough, because when you come up to tenures, always, very often, the service is something to ignore. Otherwise, you're the greatest person. We all know that, but you have done a lot to our school. Let's take a look. What have you been produced? So the last one, the merits, is I recommend to start early. And I'm very privileged that the dean of our school and also the chair are very supportive. And they are able to support me. So even molding me and shape me, so constantly mentor me. So I'm at where I am, so I can talk about it. Otherwise, I think this is a very, very tough process. So you have to be lucky enough. And another thing is also is when you come up with a publication, which I believe the most important part of the dossier. In this case, that when you do so, my recommendation is that you ought to, even you are highly interdisciplinary, even you are highly creative, even everything you've done is so great, but I think you have to look for a good traditional publisher, and you have to go through a peer review, and the peer review process is very, very challenging, but you have to take a look at that. These people are actually trying to help shaping your publication. So you look at as maybe rejection as opportunity, but you got to start early, because if one reject you, you can move on to the next one. You're running out of your time. So I believe that you got to start early, but it's very often very difficult to somehow to explain that creative process. But I like to give a suggestion is to combine tradition topics to new topics that you're trying to bring. For example, I'm writing a book about architecture computer renderings. Now, one of the things, the top part of this book is very software driven. So very often people say, well, you talk too much about software. But as a matter of fact, the title of the book is Computer Rendering. The title of the book is 3D Studio Max. The title of the book is V-Ray. So you can't just avoid talking about it. But to play safe, you can actually mix this whole thing with the tradition, the history of perspective, the rest of it, so to create things much easier for you. Thank you.
Okay, so what I want to do in the next 5 minutes is basically talk about my practice a little bit and try to extrapolate as much as I can to the field and what it means to validate that type of practice. So first of all, I'm an associate professor in the School of Media Studies here at the New School, and I've also been for the past 14 years the adjunct curator of new media arts at the Whitney Museum of American Art. I would not call my work and practice highly interdisciplinary because most of it still resides within the digital arts and humanities. But since it mostly deals with art and technology or digital art, it also veers into the sciences to some extent. And some of the work has to engage with computer science on various levels or different aspects of scientific research. So I'm going to start with one part of my practice, which is that of a theorist or art historian. And I've published in various fields. Most of the books you see up here, among them New Media in the White Cube and Beyond, and Context Providers, Conditions of Meaning in Media Arts, are focused on artistic practice. The latter two are more academic publications with a typical print run of the 2,000 to 5,000 that you get from academic publishers. Digital Art, which is coming out in its third revised edition in May, was published as part of the Thames and Hudson Worlds of Art series, and that is more of a commercial venture. The book has sold over 50,000 copies, has been translated into Korean, German, and French, with other editions probably to be added. So while this is more arts focused in my practice as more of a media theorist, I do not necessarily write about arts, but have written about, let's say, data visualization and locative media art and context awareness in the design of locative media practices, for example. So another aspect of my practice is curatorial. So what you see up here are just a couple of shows. Corey Archangel Pro Tools, which I curated for the Whitney Museum in 2011. I curate a lot online for the Whitney. And two big shows I did at the Laboral Art Center. Feedback, which was Media Art Histories, co-curated with Jemima Relly and Charlie Gear at the Laboral Art Center in Gijón in Spain, and Feed Forward, The Angel of History, which dealt much more with the political climate at the time and how we can define ourselves and artistic practice at the beginning of the 21st century, a lot more politically oriented, again, done for Laboral in 2009. And I'm currently working, this is kind of a 10-year project, on a new media art park in Turkey, in Anatolia, in Tazlar, which is unique in that it is new media art. So that just as a kind of background on the different hats I'm wearing. In terms of validating practice, one thing I learned, although I find it, with a disclaimer, deeply boring to think about it even, is how to define your role. One thing I learned is that I do not have much control over it. People make me what they want me to be within a specific context. So sometimes I'm the media theorist, there's no mention of curation. Sometimes I'm the curator, and they use my titles accordingly. And that is something I at least try to steer a little bit, because sometimes I'm the curator, and all I see listed is Whitney Museum of American Art. There's no mention of New School. Well, at the Whitney, that particular panel or conference may not be helpful at all, and for a review committee tenure dossier, I indeed need it, and it looks at least awkward to not even have the new school mentioned within that context. Another annoying thing, and again, it's really banal, but can become profound, is that, of course, conference organizers, everybody asks you for your bio. I sent my bio, and what I see printed again and again, this has happened dozens of times, is that I'm a professor of visual arts at Parsons. And the reason for that is that people, despite the fact that you sent them your bio, go for Wikipedia and copy it from there. And for the longest time, my Wikipedia entry was inaccurate, and I recently had my research assistant redo it. And even internally, it created a lot of problems occasionally. Or people were saying within media studies, why are you Parsons again, and turn up in the wrong division? Well, we're all one university. There are still some tensions, I think, in terms of where you belong and what title is being used. So, I mean, defining yourself, which again I find fairly boring, is also part of validating the work that you do and in what context you do it. I want to say something about venue, because that has been mentioned before, and I think it's a highly problematic issue. In the field of digital arts, which has existed for several decades, we have not yet seen mainstream acceptance in the art world. And in the many tenure promotion reviews, evaluations I have written, I have very often had to defend artists who work at the highest level. They are the top names in their field, yet they do not have exhibitions at the Guggenheim, the Whitney, or MoMA, because there's a completely different set of venues that are very known and established in that field, but that are not necessarily known to everyone in the field within academia, and you end up having to defend people. So Whitney Museum does not have quality attached to it, nor does the Whitney Museum show a lot of art in that field. I've been very lucky in terms of having had this affiliation, which works like a charm, but the reality also is that an exhibition like Feedback, which was massive, had more than three times the budget of the Cory Archangel show at the Whitney. So much, much more substantial exhibition, and I'm not talking about the work here, of course, not dismissing Cory's work, but with publication, attached symposium, etc. So I think we have to be in academia and evaluation very careful about these aspects. So what I want to talk about a little bit more is building bridges on various fronts. When it comes to evaluation here at the New School, of course, what we are looking for in tenure and promotion are proven sustained excellence in scholarly, creative, or professional activities, teaching and service, and a commitment to maintaining these standards. And then the question becomes, how do you validate the type of work within these contexts and make sure that it applies? So for me, a lot of the work and practice I have pursued is about basically bridging the gap, which often ends up gapping the bridge, not intentionally necessarily. So on the one hand, that's within the art world, bridging gaps between the digital art world and the mainstream art world, which in and of itself is difficult enough. And then also bridging these gaps when it comes to academia and how the work is acknowledged and validated within that context. So many of the presenters here have already mentioned how important it is to create a coherent narrative, which is absolutely key in positioning your work and connecting between all of your practices. In terms of creative practice and scholarship, I have found it very helpful to organize conferences in conjunction with exhibitions. Feed Forward, for example, also had a huge international symposium connected to it, which I co-organized with my co-curators. that of course also has a lot more to add to academic discourse than the exhibition necessarily has within media studies. And I'm not, again, I don't want to diminish the impact of the exhibition itself, but it's important to bridge these gaps. Doing classes that are related to the various types of practices, so developing course materials that directly build on creative practice, I think is an important step. So I've been teaching media art histories within the media studies department, although it's not an MFA program, but an MA program. So again, you have to bridge and make sure that the materials apply. I also organized the School of Media Studies student exhibition, so I can use my curatorial practice for better showcasing student work, which then again also builds up the service record. I also started working groups of students that were more focused on critiques and that didn't exist before within that specific area of practices that were not film related within media studies. And then of course you also want to, as much as possible, take a bird's eye view of your practices and jump to a meta level in terms of service to the field. So I'm on a lot of committees, organizing and selection committees for key conferences in the field, from the International Symposium on Electronic Arts to the Media Art Histories Conference, on many advisory boards to the organizations, have contributed white papers to NSF or NEH-funded initiatives that basically evaluate that field. So I think all of these aspects fulfill key roles in validating work and in building your academic portfolio. And I want to end by talking a little bit about methodologies and art and research. I think in the US in general, and also other countries, I don't want to isolate the US, there is a very different perception of arts and the role of arts than there is in other countries. They're not that much acknowledged as a mode of inquiry that is up to par with the sciences or anything else. You constantly have to defend why you're doing what you're doing and what the use value of it is within society and culture at large, which is pretty sad, but it's simply a given. So that is something that I think in academia we also need to get over ultimately and recognize the arts as a mode of inquiry that is on the same level as science or other type of research. Where that runs into problems, and we have had this discussion here at the New School, where I've served on the University Research Council, is when it comes to funding and even the applications for funding and support of faculty work, which have questions about methodology. And I've seen in various rounds artistic practice being dismissed because the methodology wasn't sound. And I think there are, or I have pointed out that there are huge caveats about this, particularly in the field of digital arts and new media art. You have a very strong area of art as research, where art really becomes explicitly a research-based practice. But that doesn't cover the whole territory of artistic practice. Some of the most interesting art just neglects, takes apart, and undermines methodology. And I think that's terrific, and that's how it should be. But we also have to acknowledge that when it comes to support and funding for these practices as they are being validated and feed into portfolios and tenure reviews. So I'll end it here, and we can further discuss. Thank you.
I'll try and be quite brief and really focus on some reflections. And not only reflections because I've served both on APT within Parsons, but I'm now serving on the University Promotion and Tenure Committee. University Promotion Review Committee, whatever it's called, UPRC. But the word reflections itself to me is very important in part because of the book by Donald Schoen called The Reflective Practitioner, which I think is really essential reading for any person, particularly in art and design, but really in almost any creative field, including the sciences and liberal arts, about how one thinks about one's own practice, both reflective and practitioner. So there's an emphasis both on the practice that you do and the reflections that you have. And that really is the process of coming up for promotion. It's really a reflection on your practice. And so these are going to be 6 relatively quick reflections based on my own experiences going through the process, being a reviewer of the process, and now looking at it sort of a little bit even more globally from the UPRC position. And just to give you a little sense of my background and the kind of hybridity or interdisciplinarity that I've suffered with for years, I think in my essay to apply to college, I said I was going to be a biomedical engineer. I ended up doing an independent concentration at the school I went to. You could create your own concentration in Asian performance studies. So I stretched a little bit from biomedical engineering. And that was a kind of do-it-yourself major. It blended ethnomusicology, which was my real interest, along with cultural anthropology and religious studies and theories of, and then an emerging field called performance studies that seemed to only really exist at NYU. Then when applying to graduate school in anthropology, because that was partly my interest, I wrote essays talking about how I wanted to do fake ethnographies. I was rejected by most places, but Rice, which was a very experimental school at the time, that was really looking to dismantle the field of anthropology, or at least the traditional practice on sort of political and ethical grounds, was quite welcoming. And so there, as an anthropologist, I did my work not on the Trobriand Islanders or the Nuer, but instead on French intellectuals and primarily on a pornographic philosopher named Georges Bataille and a crazy psychoanalyst named Jacques Lacan. So that was my ethnographic fieldwork, was Paris. When I left, I applied for about 14 different programs to get jobs in about 14 different fields. Eventually, I stumbled into design, something I knew nothing about, and yet I found my home, and I've been within design learning, self-taught, practicing for about 15 years now, and really sort of make my home now within design. So all along in this process, I've known very little about where I'm going, and I think I've had a very strong sort of anti-disciplinary tendency. And so that's really informed all of my practice and informed how I've gotten to where I am today. My favorite formulation of research comes from a book. It's actually sort of geared towards undergraduates about research by Mike Palmquist called The Bedford Researcher. And in that, in the very beginning, he asks, what conversation are you joining? And that to me is the best formulation of research that I've seen. If not the best, it's the most useful. Because it simplifies it and it makes it accessible. And instead, if you're someone, for example, who is a sculptor, where research may be a slightly sort of a bit of a reach in terms of how you think of your practice, you can understand it in terms of what conversations are you joining around materiality, around form, around space. And so to me, one of the things that's really important in understanding the kind of work that you're doing when you're working across disciplines is to ask the question of what conversation are you joining? Because they usually are existing. They're out there. You're part of them. Who are those people that you're referencing? And I'll come back to that. The second point I would make is your case is unique. If you are crossing disciplines, if you are putting together a dossier that is sort of exploring new connections, pushing across boundaries, your case is unique, but there's a corollary to that. You are not original. Okay, so get over yourself. Get beyond the kind of exceptionalism that you think just because I'm breaking down boundaries and all these things, I'm one of a kind, I can't be assessed. Absolutely false. You are not original. Many people are there ahead of you doing exactly this kind of work, but they may be doing it in different modalities or across different kinds of disciplines. So you need to disabuse yourself of this exceptionalism and instead start to understand that even in your breaking down of boundaries or crossing of boundaries that you are not original. In my case, for example, well, I'll get to that in a little bit. The next one, which I think is in some ways kind of the really important one, is the difference between a project, as I see it, the difference between a project and a practice. You may work on many projects, as Christiane described earlier. She works on many different projects. But coming up for promotion, coming up for review is not about a long list of projects. It's really about the practice that organizes those projects. And it's the job of the person coming up for that review to be able to articulate that practice in a way that makes those projects make sense. Some will be more centrally located, some will be more on the periphery. But I think it's really critical not to confuse the practice with the projects. In my case, for instance, I have worked on everything ranging from a dissertation about sort of psychoanalysis, gender, and post-structuralism in France, to then working for a commercial design company on a line of Tiger Woods men's grooming products, which I finally left for good reason. And then working on a community design park in Philadelphia, and then working on a citywide design festival that's still ongoing called Design Philadelphia. Also in that time, co-authoring, still in the process of co-authoring a textbook on graphic design of which I have no training. You'll begin to sense a theme in all these things, the no training part. Then moving on to develop collaboratively here at Parsons a transdisciplinary design program, which I see and frame as part of my practice still. It's a project within that, not of my own, and I'll describe what my practice is in just a moment. To working collaboratively on developing an exhibition, it's really an online curatorial experiment called Design and Violence at the Museum of Modern Art. And through that all, my objective, my practice, is one of designing open and collaborative systems that address emerging cultural conditions. And so that's a practice that can then subsume a range of different kinds of projects that may be quite different. What I'm doing at the Museum of Modern Art is very different from the work that I was doing when I was working in an underserved neighborhood in Philadelphia and helping a community to envision a park and to actually eventually have that park come to reality. Those are two radically different things, but they fit within that same way of working, which is always one that's inclusive, it's collaborative. It's one that tries to set up systems and platforms for people working together to create some real outcome. It describes how I teach, describes how I direct a program. It is a practice that translates across all those things. Your job when you're someone in this role is to not to say I'm exceptional and I cannot be defined, but you have the extra burden, I think, to be able to articulate what that practice is. And if you can't, then your reviewers and your evaluators will not be able to make sense of what you do. It's that simple. One of the tools that I think is really helpful along the way is to manifest your network. We ask our graduate students in the transdisciplinary design program to do this. What is in your network? I'll give you an example of one student named Benjamin Winter, who came up with Benjaminimus Minor. We asked them to do sort of constellations or clusters. And it was important for them because they were identifying new forms of practice for themselves within the transdisciplinary program. We don't create 20 graduating students who are all doing the same thing. We actually create 20 graduating students who are all doing different things, each one relatively unique. Not totally, but relatively. Not original, though. But what we wanted them to do was to really show not only people, but ideas, institutions, books, whatever it is that in their world is of interest, they needed to map, they needed to show. And so it's hard to see with this crappy projector, too much light and tiny text here, what's all is going on here. But it's, you can sort of read everything from the United Nations, World Health Organization, and so on, to people. I'm in there somewhere. And so knowing your network, building that, understanding that, being able to locate that, will also build up the people that need to review your work ultimately, the things that are at stake in your work, the institutions where your work should be seen and evaluated, et cetera. So it's your job, again, to actively be able to manifest this community of practice that you're building through your work. You're not original. Reframe the narrative. I mean, one of the things that I found that was, I had the good fortune to go through the Selden workshop on writing your narrative for promotion to tenure. And one of the things that was really helpful in there was that it was highly structured, and it said, you write your bit on research, scholarship, or creative practice. You write your bit on teaching, and you write your bit on service, and then you do a little of this, and then you're done. And it was wonderful to have that kind of structure. But I just kept kind of going like, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel right. It's close, but it just kind of doesn't feel right. And so finally, for me, what was important was I needed to recognize that while that's a really useful structure to start from, I needed to reframe that for myself. So that I ended up having the sort of primary argument within my narrative to be about an integrative practice. And then I went on to also address scholarship, creative practice, teaching, and service. So I didn't ignore those things, but I added something to that I felt reflected who I was as a practitioner, and that was an integrative practice that took theory and practice together, that took academia and the world outside of it together, and that I didn't make distinctions between those things, and my work needed to be seen in those ways. So you have to take that opportunity to use the structure. Last year in one of these events was sort of made the highly conservative point to just like obey the rules when it comes to promotion, tenure, any of those things. Like obey the rules, don't do anything fancy, don't try to be creative. Don't break the rules because it will only punish you. Like stick to those rules, do them well, and you'll be much better off. But I felt at some point I had a real stake in a slight twist of those rules. And so I did that, but as I said, I also kept a more conservative sort of structure to that. And finally, and this is the hardest one, it's come up over and over today, which is it is your job as someone coming up for review to make your case for impact. It's one thing when you're in the sciences or the liberal arts, as we've talked about, where there are tiers of journals and there are tiers of presses. And you can say, I'm in a top-tier journal and a middle-tier press, and I have 8 publications here and 1 book there. But what happens when you have 20,000 Twitter followers? What is that within all of this? What happens when you write for blogs? I happen to write for Fast Company's blog or for the Huffington Post from time to time. How do I make a case for impact there? It's a very new sort of format. Is it prestigious? Well, some people might think so. I happen to know for Huffington Post, they'll take just about anybody with a pulse. So it's a weird combination of, sort of some notoriety, and yet it's actually like a really low bar. But it's your job presenting to be able to make the case for impact. And so I am trying to frame, say, the Huffington Post, have to make a case that there are X numbers of readers of this. Do they all read the pieces that I do? I'm not sure. Maybe I dig a little deeper into the analytics and find out how many people have actually read the piece that I wrote for there. So I need to make that case. And if I'm, if one of you is exhibiting in a small gallery on the edge of Des Moines, Iowa, make a case for the significance of that, or at least put it into perspective so that we understand its relative importance. If you can't make that case, the reviewers will not make it for you. And so it's your job to be able to contextualize and put into some sort of relative value system the impact of the work that you're doing. I want to end with just a quote from Donald Schoen, because this sort of breaking in boundaries, all this sort of stuff may seem like kind of just academic dilettantism from time to time, but I like this formulation of it better because I think it is important work. And in this case, Donald Schoen writes, "The radical critique carries a utopian vision of social reform. It is necessary to demystify the professions, exposing class interests masquerading as technical rationality, so that society can achieve democracy, equality, and social justice." So I throw down the gauntlet to all of you to not masquerade as technical rationalists, and instead to achieve democracy, equality, and social justice, as I do every day.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dave Carroll. Appreciate being invited to this panel. And I'll try to kind of knit together some of the ideas today. I did not prepare anything. I figured in certain ways, being at this moment in the day, it'd be important to kind of weave things together. And there were a lot of opportunities to connect some of the thinking. So, but before I do that, I do have to do just a quick biographical sketch, because just like Jamer mentioned, I'm unique but not original. So, but what's interesting about my quick journey is that it started being an industry, and then the promotion process itself radically shifted the momentum to a particular way in order to try and get promoted. So here's a case where the process itself and the criteria could move someone's career in a particular direction. So I was doing client work in digital design, and I was full-time teaching since 2001 here, after adjunct teaching, after being a graduate student here. And when the choice came to choose the track, you had the choice to do traditional tenure or extended employment, which at the time was really created as a grandfather category for really people like me who had not created a career to get tenure. And so if that was going to be the outcome without the category of EE, I would have, so little time to pivot towards that. But even then, going through the handbook and looking at what it would take to get to rank good in research, scholarship, and creative practice as an EE candidate was even a bar higher than just looking at my industrial work could achieve. And so I had to adopt practices of academia, such as find opportunities for peer review, apply for grants, try to get in exhibitions, and so on. So Aaron said before that there are people who go to conferences just to earn the points. And in my case, I definitely did things to put things on the CV to have a chance to make it to where I am, but I don't regret doing that, and that was actually a very positive force for me to transform my career in a positive direction, to better appreciate what it is to be in academia and to grow my identity far beyond just doing client work. So then once surviving that process and getting promoted, again, an opportunity to transform, because this great freedom and responsibility to continue to grow and to continue to do things. And so to this day, I still see myself as a hybrid, 1 foot in the door of academia and 1 foot in the doors of industry. And indeed, that hybridity is a very exciting place to be, especially right now. So it's a truly exciting time to be alive, and an exciting time to be alive at the New School, because the New School is a truly idiosyncratic place. I was joking at lunch that the prototypical American university is driven by science and athletics, of which we have neither. And so the joke, jokes earlier by others of, what a wonderful place to do things here and break the rules, because we're not like other institutions. We are, on one hand, since the middle of the early aughts, meaning around 2005, the great transformation of this school towards a higher professionalized school, adopting tenure, the part-time faculty union organizing, the growth of faculty governance here. I've been here to witness that transformation, and as it affected us as a community, and then figuring out, well, what is the criteria of promotion that we decide as a community because we're in the New School? And so I noticed when Anthony Aziz was presenting, as he went to Google and he typed in his name, you see the autocomplete. And you think about this idea of tenure and promotion as a kind of algorithm, a kind of black box that you don't know how it works when you put into it. So you put your dossier in and you put it into a black box, and that confidentiality is a kind of trade secret that only the people, you know, inside of the black box know how it works. And that black box is so confusing to go into it. And it's very much like the algorithm of Google. We don't know how Google works, but it certainly defines this. So then you have the things like names. So here, Aziz Ansari is a very popular person, but as soon as you type CU, there they are, and there they appear. So in some ways, Google is recognizing the prominence of this artistic partnership. We can't deny the power of being recognized by the Google algorithm. That indeed, we don't know how this works. This is a trade secret, but it defines culture. And to be recognized in Google autocomplete is an undeniable recognition of an impact in the world. We just don't know how it works. So in some ways, it's similar to applying for promotion. So Robert Kirkbride also made the metaphor of sort of being atoms bouncing around, and indeed the magnetism of that is another sort of metaphorical way. And the reason why we can't sort of see the atomic energy work, so Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, as soon as you observe the atomic activity, you destroy it. You can't observe how the tenure process works because you would destroy it. That veil of confidentiality is key to making it work. And indeed, if we knew the exact parameters of what it took to get tenure, then the system would be gameable, just like people go to conferences to check off the boxes. If we knew how, if the way Google worked was transparent, then this would be filled with spam. That spammers and hackers would destroy the integrity of why Google works. So you need the shroud of secrecy to make it a functional system. So this idea of the trade secret also fits into why defining validation in the commercial field is especially difficult in an academic context, because academia prides itself on its transparency and the importance of attribution and citation. And these ideas are what make, in the traditional forms of promotion and tenure, sort of how you are recognized in a quantitative way. But in commercial contexts, you might be at the mercy of a non-disclosure agreement, like Timo Risanen described, that legal constructs and more black boxes prevent you from achieving the kind of open transparency that's required. So this becomes really difficult when you're trying to establish your impact in a commercial context. It's not like you can, just look at attribution and measuring that, because much commercial work is shielded by layers of client, layers of sponsor, and the sort of anonymous quality of being a commercial designer. But on the contrast of that, in an era where the rise of the identity of the designer or the practitioner or the artist is all the more available to be seen and understood by the algorithm. So the fact that they appear over here is a significant representation of their recognition algorithmically. That the algorithm knows that this is an entity. The entity recognition is significant. And so basically, if you're sort of trying to make your case of your commercial, your presence commercially, even if you're not a commercial practitioner, I would argue that the fact that you are recognized as an entity is a significant achievement. And for me personally, I have an interesting problem because I don't have a unique name. And in fact, the most famous Dave Carroll is not me and could never be me. Dave Carroll is a famous musician because United Airlines broke his guitar. He wrote a song about it and now has an entire speaking career going around the world telling the story of how United Airlines broke his guitar and has made him famous for it. So indeed, the decision of your parents to name you or the family that you have been born into has a dramatic effect on your role and positioning in these algorithms. I wanted to also echo what Nina Khrushcheva said at the beginning of, basically, if you just do what you love and do it really well, you're going to get promoted. Like, don't worry about it. Like, it will shine through if you, like Jamer said, follow the rules, go through the process. But if you truly are doing what you love to do, that's going to shine through in your dossier. And that this is an incredible place to be able to do that. I also want to pick up on a comment that Vlada Nikolic mentioned, because he also was in a similar position of choosing extended employment at that time. And I think the difference between sort of opportunities to develop a career in technology versus filmmaking. So he's coming from the perspective of the film industry, which itself is protectable by copyright. And so, therefore, to create that intellectual property, have it be protected by copyright, and have it be able to go and enter into the film world, it can be judged in the context of that industry. So it doesn't have to be a blockbuster film. It just has to be critically acclaimed. Now, in my field, which is in technology, in developing technologies, in fact, yes, there are patents, but not every technology idea can be patented. And so this idea of it's possible to make work that has a profound impact on society, democracy, and yet cannot be protected intellectually. And so how do you measure its impact? So in this case, how is the value understood? How do you make the case for this? And this is a big problem. And he said that financial success is not relevant in the promotion review process. I don't know if those are his exact words, but I would argue that you can't necessarily rule it out. That if a candidate here created something that was a huge success, either financially or had a huge impact on the marketplace, that you could make a case in your dossier for this, and you shouldn't necessarily rule it out. Do you hinge your whole case on it? That would be a risk. But to rule it out is to put academia in an unhealthy bubble. And indeed, Parsons has sort of in its history had a very comfortable relationship with industry. And so to ignore that tradition of Parsons being very comfortable as a collaborator with industry sort of definitely came before its unification with the new school. So I would just say that, everyone has a sort of transformation story, how you have been transformed by this institution, and how you will continue to evolve after you are renewed and or promoted. And the opportunities here are tremendous to participate in commercial contexts, and increasingly the acceptance of commercial impact is increasingly measurable in particular ways. So I'll close with sort of the idea of Twitter, because it was mentioned before. It's not uncommon for, just as a Twitter user, you can make a tweet, and then in a matter of hours, it can reach 25,000 people. This has happened to me over the weekend. And so the fact is, that's now measurable by Twitter. The Twitter analytics are available to you. And so the way that you can actually trace your ideas and watch them disseminate and see other people engaging with them and transmitting them is actually, it creates the ability to actually watch your ideas be seeded into other minds. And so I would argue that in 5 to 10 years, you will see Twitter analytics used in the cases to show how one idea disseminated and impacted many other ways, and it will be absolutely traceable. And that's a powerful possibility. So I'll end on that.
So listening to Dave makes me even more regretful that I haven't been able to be around for the earlier talks. I was giving a lecture this morning at NYU in a class. But when I did come in and heard the last panel, I think I'll try and draw a bit on that, and also I'm sure that you're going to recognize some echoes in what I have to say. I mean, I really appreciate and have lived by one of the things you just said, Dave, which is, you know, really follow what you love and are passionate about in doing. And at the same time, I'm also very conscious of the fact, having been on various advancement promotion tenure committees for now 18 years of my life, that, you know, there is that kind of set of realities that drives you and that makes you compelled to do the kind of work you do and do it as well as you possibly can do it. And then there are also the realities of what, you know, how to evidence all of that and how to really, as Jamer talked about, make a convincing case in a dossier. And so I was reflecting on this in my own practice, and I think I'm on this panel partially because a lot of what I do is often outside of the scope of the more convenient forms of validations or institutions that validate. Because, and so I'm, you know, very aware of operating in marginal zones on multiple fronts, partially because I have a kind of activist practice that meets cultural practice in what I do. And so a lot of the things I do are actually community-based activities, which, you know, sometimes are in areas of the world or in areas of the city that don't have the kind of glitz and glamour of, you know, a Whitney Museum or other kinds of things. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of where I'm coming from, I just want to suggest that what I do is to create socially engaged, participatory curatorial projects. And those are often in what Mary Louise Pratt has called contact zones. If you're familiar with her work, she defines a contact zone as a social space where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other on a daily basis, often in the context of highly asymmetrical power relations, a place where people have been historically separated, and they come together into contact with each other to establish new forms of relations. So it's exactly the sort of creating of those or framing of those kinds of contact zones that I focused. And as a result of that, my work, this way of being a curator, does not really neatly fit into any one box. It's very different than the kind of work you would do in more conventional or traditional curatorial practices, where, for example, you might meet very interesting artists or designers and you research their work very fully, and then you ultimately assemble these works in a meaningful way within the context of a white cube kind of gallery. So my job in how I've practiced it is to actually create frameworks for participation so that public art events can be the site for collaborative work between cross-cultural communities and communities that operate in these kind of contact zones. So while I sometimes use art galleries as part of my curatorial framework, the majority of my projects are actually very consciously situated in non-art environments, in things like village cafes, in urban open-air markets in neighborhood backyards. And that's partially because I really enjoy the challenge of situating art and design practice in places where people are not expecting to encounter them. You know, because I'm really interested in reaching and involving broader and more multiple publics, not just to be spectators of an event that I've created for them, but rather to be co-creators of that actual project. So the curatorial work I do is often collaborative in some way, it's often co-curated, it's often co-created. So you can probably already sense that this kind of work operates in this very interstitial, multidisciplinary space. I mean, is it contemporary art practice? Is it contemporary public art? Is it a form of participatory urbanism? Is it a kind of way in which you do architectural interventions in various communities? So, I mean, there are many sort of ways in which you can frame this as having a kind of echo or practice or link. But to complicate this more, the majority of my projects happen to be in parts of the world that do not have long-standing traditions of white cube galleries, because a lot of what I do is situated in the post-Soviet world and also in the Balkans. And there just isn't that long history of the kind of white cube environment. Plus, these are cities and towns that are considered kind of off the grid when it comes to sanctioning bodies of many official art institutions and art journals, et cetera. And honestly, if I had $1 for every time people have asked me, like, why do you spend your time working in obscure places like Tbilisi, Georgia? You know, why don't you focus on Berlin or New York instead, where you can have more visibility, you know, you can kind of be more in the mix. I mean, I would really be quite rich by now. But all of these things are what present unique challenges when you're trying to validate this kind of community-based practice. So, you know, I mean, for one thing, I've been working in these sites for, you know, many, many years, and one of the ways in which I work is that I go back and work again and again and again in a site, building on previous projects, but also building cultural networks and the kinds of relationships with, you know, hundreds of artists and designers and students. So, I mean, it isn't that I don't know why I'm compelled to do the work I'm doing. I mean, I know why I'm doing it, and I know why I think that's a really fascinating part of the world, because it's deeply underrepresented and it's got incredibly rich and complex social and political history. But you know, the challenge is really, how do I get others to understand why that might be understood as valuable to know about or to practice in? So that this challenge about showing evidence of impact on the lives of the people in these places, the impact of modeling this kind of work within other professional discourses, that's kind of what I have found myself facing, not just when I'm out in the field doing my work because I care about it and I love it and I believe in it, but like, how do I bring it back and make it actually conversant with other kinds of disciplines, and how do you prove it in an academic dossier? So this, I think, will kind of echo something that Jamer said. I think you have to really ask, in whose eyes is the work important or impactful? Okay, so whose validation are you trying to seek out? And so on the one hand, this kind of makes me think about how to think strategically in the production of projects and also in the production of a dossier that represents the kind of practice that doesn't fall neatly into you know, well-known zones or well-known kinds of practices. I mean, for example, some of the things that I've had to think about over the years is, you know, because I do collaborative practice, who am I collaborating with as my kind of key partner in a place that I'm not from? So in that case, you know, you really have to ask yourself, who are you going to stand to learn the most from? Who has the kind of insider knowledge? But also, who has the kind of networks, professional networks, and you know, discursive insights that will enable your project that you do together to really have the kind of impact on the community that you're hoping for. So I'm really careful about who I like co-curate projects with, for example, or co-author texts with, because I'm looking for that to be something that I learn from, but also something that will actually give the project a kind of esteem that it wouldn't perhaps have as much of otherwise. The other thing I think that maybe sometimes you don't think about until you're putting a dossier together is that, when you think about peer review, and that echoes back to your this where we were sitting last year at this time. I mean, who you collaborate with, they are also a kind of peer, as is the funders that you turn to get the money to help you realize the projects. So for me, the granting organizations are also their own form of peer review. And so when I've done these kinds of projects, I mean, there are not that many bodies of funders who give money to do projects in the post-Soviet world. So but I make sure that I connect with those funding sources, because there's a certain kind of cultural capital that comes along with the financial capital. And there is a kind of a vetting process that they do when they decide whether or not to give you the cash. So places like the US Embassy, for example, or the Open Society Foundation or Trust for Mutual Understanding, those are granting organizations that I understand to be competitive environments, that where the outcome, if you get the money, actually can mean something, and that their giving it to you demonstrates a kind of faith in the cultural importance of your work. So that's one thing. I think the other thing that I've had to think a lot about is press. When we do a project, what happens if mainstream academic or cultural journals don't take interest in the particular kind of marginalized or non-commercially driven practice that you're doing? So, for me, it's been really very important to make sure that we get the attention of local press, right, as well as kind of higher desire to kind of circulate in other forms of media. So there's a lot of work about kind of making sure that you've got newspaper coverage, local TV, radio, blogs, that there's no question that the impact locally is being felt, and that you can actually kind of show that through publications and pointing to various kinds of articles. So even if it's a modest newspaper from a neighborhood, make sure that they're learning about your project if you're doing these kinds of community-based works, and make sure that they're, excited about it enough to run a feature story. I mean, it's sort of simple. You want to have that kind of work. And for me, because a lot of what I do is I bring U.S. artists to Georgia to co-create projects for various shows and events that I do, the local community is doubly interested, because they like to write about their own, but they also like to write about this exotic other, which we become in that context. So, you want to try to think a lot about what it is that locally, and this is where working with somebody from that place can be very helpful. What would be of interest locally, and how do you get the attention of the sources that you can then point to in a dossier? And for me, it's also been very important to try to not only have it be a local recognition, but like, how does the activity going on there begin to make its way back into the more sanctioned circles of the art world? And I mean, to be honest, it wasn't until the 9th year of projects that I was doing in Georgia that an art critic from Art Forum magazine actually contacted me and said, she was so bored with going to all of the normal biennales that she just, it was that like, I want to make a discovery kind of thing. And I've never been to that part of the world, and so, I'm bored by these other things. So, I mean, okay, a lot of people were doing things many years before I got there. But, there's that moment of the discovery by sort of the more powerful vehicles that are then, it's also an opportunity to kind of help put this activity and this region on the map. So, that kind of dialogue to also not only make sure that it's happening locally, but then try to insert it into dialogues that are happening in other publications and forums is important. So I would say if there are any significant local arts or cultural or scholarly journals, then get their attention. And to be honest, if you're going to be working over a period of years, if none of those publications exist yet, then find out if there's any interest in getting one started and actually work with the local people to launch them and help support them. So then there also begins to be a kind of presence in that community that captures more likely the interest in other sorts of venues. So for me, what are your broader peer networks, to go back to the sort of map that Jamer was talking about, who are doing similarly spirited work around the world is really important. Because as we've talked about, you're not original. You want to be seeking out conversations with other curators or artists or urbanists or designers or whoever it is who's interested, in my case, in community-based public art practices and socially engaged curatorial projects, and they're out there. So you have to find them, and you have to begin to cultivate that dialogue, which inevitably will lead to invitations to present at conferences, opportunities for residencies, public lectures, fellowships, et cetera. So that need to insert yourself into a broader local and international set of conversations is really important. As I kind of pointed to a little bit earlier, it's very important that you produce formal documentation of whatever it is you're doing. So even if you don't have a significant budget, and God knows I've been working with like shoestring budgets on most of the things, like make sure that you've created either a paper trail or a digital trail of the project. So it's been great for me that Parsons grad students have been very helpful in working with me to actually create that paper trail, but to do project booklets, websites, archives, that's very important, not only within the context of the dossier, but also as a means to keep your peers in these broader networks informed about what it is you're doing, so that you share those kinds of projects with one another. And then oftentimes they will invite you to share that project in a much better funded forum. So like, a shoestring budget project I did in Georgia then gets more airtime on Cyprus in the context of an architecture program in a university, because they got a huge European Union grant. So, then the publication, the book comes out, and then it's a chapter in a book. So there are ways in which the connectivity in broader dialogues can also then help you have more opportunities for more visibility. So I think it's very strategic to be thinking in a systemic way, not to just be doing your projects in isolation, but to be understanding them as part of more visible events. So whenever I time things, I find out what else is happening in the area. Like, I would never do a project, well, that isn't true, I might, but I often will do a project when I know an international art event is happening. So you're either invited into that event to be officially part of that event, or you become like a satellite event that rides on the tails of another event. This happens in Venice, the Venice Biennale all the time, as many of you have gone and seen probably. So there are ways in which you can do what I think Otto von Busch often very eloquently talks about as hacking. Rather than inventing from scratch the entire infrastructure on your own, you ride the energy system that already exists, and you find out who's there, and you pull people over, and you get the kind of visibility that creates more energy around the project, which then can finally make its way back into academic conferences and journals, because you can reflect on these ways of working, and then again more clearly articulate what discursive fields your work draws from and is in conversation with. So I think it's really, those are the kind of key things. I think I'm stating the obvious in many ways and sort of echoing what came before. But, you basically kind of want to prove that there are increasing numbers of individuals who are either sympathetic or excited about your own project goals. And that helps a lot to keep going in the face of what often seems like, working in the shadows of what you know to be an important kind of political work. So, thank you.